All right, so we're going to go ahead. Why is it not? Oh, it is working. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and talk about evolutionary theory in this video. And so really, when we talk about evolution, we're really going to be focused in on this idea, that the idea of change through time. And really, it's something that's happening still today at work, because really what they call the central dogma of biology is this idea. So we're going to talk about the central dogma of biology is that our DNA, or any living thing's DNA that exists either in its nucleus or just in the cell itself, if it's a prokaryote, DNA gets transcribed into RNA, which then gets translated into a protein. And we're going to see over and over and over and over again how proteins do all kinds of things in cells, in organisms, in tissues, in just everything. So proteins are going to communicate between cells. Proteins are going to be antibodies. They're going to be enzymes. They're going to do all kinds of things. We're going to see that over and over and over and over again. So if we have a mutation or a change in our DNA, it's going to change the RNA, and it's going to change the protein and the shape of the protein, which then gives the organism a different trait. And that trait might be an advantage to that organism, or it might not. So let's kind of talk about how a long time ago, there are two scientists that kind of recognized those ideas, that traits, because there was different shape proteins, because there was a mutation in the DNA, so these traits looked different in different types of organisms. And so these are things that there's a scientist named Lamarck, and we're going to look at what things he said that were correct and what things he said that were a little off. But they're not. We're going to actually later talk about how they weren't really wrong, but we're going to call them wrong for right now. So Lamarck said this. He said, life forms have changed over time. Great. So they looked at fossils, or they looked at different things, and they said, hey, these things weren't the same as they were a long time ago. The things that he kind of said were wrong is the mechanism behind this change. They didn't even understand DNA, but they didn't also understand a few other things that we're going to get into when we talk about our friend Darwin here. So evolution responded to needs of the organism, and that's not necessarily true. It's really almost the reverse. And then he had this theory of what's called the use and disuse theory. So if an organism used it, it would become stronger. So if you use something, it would become bigger and stronger. So the classic example is, if you use your muscles, they grow bigger and stronger in your lifetime. Great, totally true. But the problem was with his theory is that he thought that meant that you would inherit that acquired trait. And that's not the case, right? If my dad were to have worked out his entire life and be a big bodybuilder, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to come out with being a big bodybuilder type size person. Okay, so I would inherit those traits. Or if my dad was really, really tall because he used his height to his advantage, so his neck stretched longer and longer, like a giraffe trying to reach the trees, that would mean that I was also a tall giraffe. The reason why I was a tall giraffe is because there was something in my DNA that coded for proteins that made my neck stretch longer, and that was an advantage to me. So that's really what Darwin's going to say. So Darwin, we're going to look at two of his theories that he came up with. So his first is what's called the descent with modification. I should write out the word with. And he said species evolved from ancestral species. So we came from ancestors. And he said all organisms are related. We all have DNA. We all have very similar traits. We all do cellular respiration for the most part, things like that. And so he said organisms descended from a common ancestor. So for our purposes, we're going to adopt this theory for our class. Obviously, many of us do not maybe believe that we all came from a common ancestor, and that's okay. But biology has adopted this theory. The theory that is probably a little bit easier for us to grasp onto and understand is this idea of natural selection. And really, that's what we're really going to focus in on this class. In fact, the unit is not called evolution anymore. We call it natural selection. So it's this struggle for survival. Organisms are trying to gain enough resources in order to grow big enough in order to reproduce, to pass on their genes for the next generation. So there's a survival for the fittest. Those that are the biggest, the strongest, the fastest, the best at getting the resources, aka food, are going to be able to survive to pass on their genes to the next generation. And because of this survival of the fittest, and because there's not enough resources available, there's an unequal success in reproduction. Those that are bigger, stronger, faster, better at hiding, better camouflage, better, all those kinds of things. There's an unequal success in reproductions, which leads to a gradual change. Those that are bigger, stronger, have those proteins that make them faster. They make them better at running away from their prey or away from their predators, are going to be able to survive in order and reproduce and pass those genes or those traits on to the next generation. Okay, so let's look at some evidences for this evolution. So one of the evidences is the fossil record. And this is really where Darwin and a lot of the guys and where the old ones. So they're looking at changes in the fossil record or fossil forms. And so we saw things like that there were dinosaurs that fly and birds that fly. We saw things that similar skull structures, similar bones, similar all of those types of things. And then they started to look at what they call the anatomical record. So we're looking at the anatomy of an organism. And you're going to compare those two things. So one of the things that they want to do is they want to look at the homologous structures versus analogous structures. So the homologous are the things that actually, we're going to star it, whatever, somehow, that's a terrible star, I don't know what's going on there, allow us to understand that homologous means this, that the same structure but serves a different function. This is evidence for evolution. So the example that I'm going to give you is some mammals, 3 different mammals, a bat, a whale, and a human, all have the same bones in either the wing, the flipper, or the hand. Same bones in appendage, right? Their front appendage, totally different structure, totally different functions. Now contrast that with what we call an analogous structure. Analogous structures have the same function, but come from a different common ancestor, or they evolved separately. So it's evolution solving the same problem, different times. Ancestor. So the example is the wings of a bird and the wings of a bat have completely different structures. Flight has evolved many different times in many different creatures because it's an adaptation that's great for survival. So those are different evolutionary paths, the wings in a bat and the wings in a butterfly. Okay. And then also part of that is you want to look at vestigial organs. So these are kind of what we want to call like the leftovers. So these are things that they no longer are needed, so they no longer are used. No longer needed, so no longer used. So some examples, we have a tailbone. Last time I checked, humans don't have tails, but we have a bone for them. Whales have pelvic bones where their hind appendages would attach. Last time I checked, whales don't have hind appendages. They don't have little legs sticking out of them. So, but they evolved from something that did have legs. Same thing like humans evolved from something that did have a tail. Okay, the new evidence for evolution. So Darwin really focused in on these top two in terms of his evidence when he was really looking at them. Is they started doing molecular DNA. So this is probably in the last 50 years we've really looked at this, and really probably more specifically in the last 25 years. And we're going to compare changes in the DNA sequence. I'm going to put DNA or protein sequence. And so we're really looking at those changes, and we're going to look a lot at molecular data throughout our whole course. We'll see it this semester and even into second semester. Then the last piece of evidence for evolution that we'll talk about in our class is artificial selection. It's selection for specific traits by humans, by humans. So it's we're artificially doing this. Most agriculture is artificially selected items. So, for example, let's give you an example of that. Mustard plants. The original mustard plant is kind of a weed, and they grow all around here. They're the ones that are yellow in the springtime. They turn our hills yellow. But humans have artificially selected them into things like kale, cabbage, broccoli. Can't spell broccoli. I can't spell. Cauliflower. I'm going to give you some other fun ones. Kohlrabi. Some of you are like, I don't know what that is. And some of you are like, there's all kinds of different versions of broccoli and cauliflower, like radicchio and whatever. But you can kind of get the idea that we've selected for specific traits. So they took mustard plants and they said, okay, we want to really get the leaves going. And so they would select ones that are more leafier, and then they would allow those to breed with each other. So they would and then they would allow them to better survive. And then the next generation would produce more leafy ones. And so they would pick the most leafy ones, and they would breed those together, and then only pick the leafy ones and allow those ones to survive. And so over time, the leafy ones were getting selected for. And so that's how you get kale. Okay. All right, so we're going to kind of focus in on this idea of what we call microevolution. Microevolution is also kind of known, it's kind of a vague term, but we're looking at just changes in a gene pool of a population. So evolution doesn't act on an individual, it acts on a population. That is like a big thing. So you're not going to say, oh, this organism evolved. That's Lamarck's idea. Organisms don't evolve, populations evolve. So it's changing a gene pool of a population, a group of organisms. Okay. And you're going to hear me say this a lot. And we'll look at this when we do Hardy-Weinberg equation in a few weeks, but it's change in relative frequencies of alleles. So we're going to look at the amount, like I just, frequencies of alleles or traits. So when I was just talking about the kale, there would be more, we would be looking at more leafy ones in a population. Okay, so there's some causes of microevolution. So one is, these are really just terms that you're gonna need to know. So genetic drift is one of them. So we're gonna look at, and this, what genetic drift is it's just drifting in a population. So changes in gene pool of a population due to random chance. And there's two subcategories. So one is what we call the bottleneck effect. Some dramatic event happens. An event happens. So like a hurricane, a giant storm, a tsunami, a something, and only some alleles make it out. And we're going to do a little demo in class to help us understand that. And it's by chance, it's random which alleles make it out. Make it out. And then the second one is, we're going to kind of flow down into here, but that's okay because the next box is small, is the founder effect. And founder effect is when you have a small group break off and some individuals are separated. The difference between founder effect and bottleneck effect is in founder effect, the original population still exists. In bottleneck effect, there was a disaster, so they are no longer there. So founder effect is like how you colonize islands. Okay. The next one is gene flow. And it's change, in a gene pool due to migration of individuals. Think of the, like when something comes into a population, it migrates in, there's genes flowing into that population. Another cause for microevolution is mutations. So when that DNA changes, we're gonna introduce a new allele, a new trait, a new protein. When we have non-random mating, this is a good one. We're going to talk about sexual selection. We'll watch a couple videos. So a really good example. So the mates aren't randomly chosen. A good example of this is lions. So the females will really want to mate with the male that has the biggest mane and the prettiest mane and the most well-groomed mane. And so over time, the male lions with the best mane are going to pass those traits on to their offspring. So over time, the male lions' manes get bigger and bigger and bigger and prettier. Now there's an upper limit to that, right? Because there's a trade-off. And the trade-off is that mane cost a lot of energy to produce. It's hot. It doesn't allow him to hunt very well and acquire resources. So there's an upper limit to how pretty that male can get. And then the last one is the one we just talked about, is natural selection, or just that differential reproductive success. That's really what we mean when we're talking about natural selection. Differential reproductive success. So all of these things can lead to changes in a population over time. Okay. And then the last part is we're just going to look at different types of natural selection. And so there's 3 different types. So what we're going to see here is that and this is a little bit hard to read, but these are supposed to be snails that are varying colors. So light snails and dark snails. And we're going to pretend that in this population, that environment is really light colored. So these ones get selected for. And so over time, we see a shift towards the left, towards the light color. And over time, only the light survive. Okay. So we're going to shift it to one side. In stabilizing, so we're going to kind of see like this over time, the graph will be more to the left in this case. In stabilizing, we're going to see they're going to be selected for the middle. Okay. And we're going to see, like, for whatever reason, the environment selects for this middle trait. And then in diversifying, or actually a better word, cross that off and write disruptive. We're going to see this, where it makes 2 humps, and we're going to see selection to the extremes, not the middle, but to the extremes. This leads to speciation, or to creation of 2 new species, which we will talk about in chapter 17. Okay. And then the last thing is, like, just back to sexual selection. So we said on the previous page that this means that mates are not randomly chosen. So an intra-selection, this one, our males are fighting to mate. So the females are like, you guys sort it out, figure out who's the biggest, toughest, and then we'll just mate with him. Elephant seals are a good example of that, and we will watch a fun video about that. And then in interselection, the females choose. So that a lot of birds are like this, where the males do a really pretty dance for them, or they decorate something. And so we'll look at some. So I'm going to put example, birds of paradise. And when I mean birds of paradise, I don't mean the flowers, I mean the actual birds. And watch some videos about that too, as well, in class. So all of those things are concepts that we'll review in class. And so bring your questions and we'll talk about it then.